It's a Saturday night. Your phone lights up for the third time. Someone's asking if you're coming out tonight. The music is already going somewhere. There's a group, there's a plan, and somewhere in your chest, there's this quiet, complicated feeling that you've never quite been able to name because part of you wants to be the kind of person who says yes, throws on a jacket, and walks out the door without overthinking it. But you don't. You type back something vague, maybe next time. Not feeling great. Early morning tomorrow. And then you set the phone face down, pull a blanket over your lap, and something happens that almost nobody talks about. You feel relief. Deep, immediate, full body relief. Like a pressure valve just opened, and then comes the other thing. The thought that sneaks in right behind the relief. The quiet voice that says, "What's wrong with me?" You watch other people move through social situations like it's effortless, like they're refueling at those gatherings, not depleting, and you wonder if something inside you is wired differently, if there's something you're missing, if the preference for your own company, for silence, for a book, for the specific calm of your own four walls is a flaw. You've been quietly managing your whole life. But here's what almost nobody understands about this. That preference, that pull towards stillness, it isn't a malfunction. It isn't shyness that needs to be cured or anxiety that needs to be managed away. Science is beginning to reveal that people who consistently prefer solitude over socializing often carry a specific cluster of neurological traits, rare ones that don't just explain the preference, they explain almost everything else about you too. We've been handed the wrong story about this for a long time. The story goes like this. Humans are social animals. Extroversion is the default setting. If you don't light up in a crowd, if parties feel like labor, if you'd genuinely rather be alone on a Friday night than anywhere else, something needs fixing. You're described as shy, antisocial, a bit cold, maybe a little sad. The world built its offices in open plans, its schools in group projects, its parties in crowded rooms, and then decided that anyone who doesn't thrive in those spaces is the problem. That story isn't just wrong, it's backwards, because what research in neuroscience, personality psychology, and sensory processing has been quietly building toward across decades of studies is a completely different picture. People who feel most alive in solitude aren't retreating from the world because they're damaged. They're retreating because their brains process the world at a fundamentally higher resolution. The signal is louder, the input is richer, the noise is more noise, and sometimes the only sane response to an overstimulating world is to walk into a quiet room, close the door, and breathe. This isn't a consolation, it's a mechanism, and once you understand it, the whole story changes. There's a phrase I want to introduce here, because it's the most accurate way I've found to describe what's happening in the brains of people who prefer solitude. I call it the deep signal architecture. The deep signal architecture is the neurological pattern where the brain doesn't just receive information from the world, it processes it further, longer, and at more layers than average, more associations, more emotional tagging, more cross-referencing with memory and meaning. It's not that people with this architecture are more sensitive in the fragile sense. They're more sensitive in the way a high-resolution camera is more sensitive to light. The same scene contains more data, more texture, more weight, and here's the thing about a high-resolution camera. You can't run it in a loud, chaotic room and expect clean images. The environment has to match the instrument. So when someone with a deep signal architecture walks into a packed bar, a loud family dinner, or an office full of overlapping conversations, their brain isn't being antisocial, it's overloaded. It's running at full capacity just to keep up with the input. The deep signal architecture shows up across 5 specific brain traits. And if you're the kind of person who's always felt most like yourself when you're alone, I want to walk through each one. Because by the end of this, you won't just understand yourself better. You'll understand why every system in your life that was built for someone else has always felt like a slightly wrong-sized coat. Before we get into the traits, we need to talk about the thing that's been working against you. Because it isn't just cultural messaging, though that's real. It's something more specific. the way the modern world was designed, almost accidentally, to exhaust exactly the kind of brain you have. Noise is the villain here, not just acoustic noise, though that's part of it, but informational noise, emotional noise, social noise, the constant low hum of obligation, performance, and stimulation that never fully shuts off. A world of open-plan offices where you can't think, phones that buzz every 11 minutes, social gatherings where every conversation is surface level and high speed, and somehow still exhausting. News cycles that demand immediate reactions, social media that rewards performance over depth. Every single one of these things is a direct attack on the deep signal architecture. Not because people with this brain type are weak, but because their processing system was never designed for this volume of shallow input. It was designed for depth, for sustained attention, for environments where signal matters more than speed. The tragedy is that most people with the deep signal architecture spend years interpreting their own exhaustion as a personal failure. They think they're not trying hard enough, not social enough, not adaptable enough. They push themselves into loud rooms and force themselves through event after event, wondering why they come home feeling hollowed out rather than filled up, and they never get the explanation. Nobody tells them that a Stradivarius violin can't function as a drum kit. The instrument isn't the problem, the use is. So let's talk about the 5 traits, not as a list, as a portrait, because these don't sit in isolation. They connect, they reinforce each other, and together, they paint a very specific kind of mind. The first trait is high sensory processing sensitivity. This is the most foundational piece. Research pioneered by psychologist Elaine Aron found that roughly 15 to 20% of the population carries a nervous system that processes sensory and emotional information more deeply than average. More neural resources are allocated to each piece of input. Subtlety gets picked up that others miss. The way someone's voice shifts when they're lying, the emotional undercurrent in a room, the specific quality of light on a late afternoon that carries some kind of feeling you can't name but definitely feel. People with high sensory processing sensitivity aren't just feeling more, they're registering more. And because the processing is deeper, the recovery time is longer. Solitude isn't a preference, it's a biological necessity. The second trait is a highly active default mode network. This is the part of your brain that's most active, not when you're doing something, but when you're not, when you're daydreaming, reflecting, planning, imagining. Neuroscientists call it the brain's resting state, but it's anything but restful. It's actually doing some of the most sophisticated cognitive work that exists. People who prefer solitude consistently show stronger default mode network activity. Their inner world is genuinely richer, more populated, more interesting to them than most people's inner worlds are to them. This isn't narcissism or self-absorption. It's neural architecture. When the inside is that vivid, the outside has to be pretty extraordinary to compete. The third trait is low latent inhibition. This is a less well-known one, but it's critical. Latent inhibition is the brain's filter, the mechanism that decides which stimuli are worth paying attention to and which ones should be tuned out. Most brains have strong filters. Things that aren't immediately relevant get blocked before they ever reach full consciousness. People with low latent inhibition have weaker filters. More gets through, more registers as potentially significant. Researcher Jordan Peterson and his colleagues at Harvard found this trait correlates strongly with both creativity and what's sometimes described as sensory overwhelm in crowded environments. When everything is potentially signal, noise is genuinely exhausting rather than just annoying. Walking into a party doesn't feel like entertainment, it feels like being handed 50 conversations to monitor simultaneously. The fourth trait is depth-seeking over breadth-seeking in connection. This one is relational rather than neurological, but it runs directly from the first 3. When you process deeply, you want depth in return. Small talk, the conversational bread and butter of most social gatherings, feels like eating air. It doesn't satisfy anything. The question, "How was your weekend?" doesn't interest you, not because you're arrogant, but because you already know neither of you is going to answer it honestly. People with the deep signal architecture aren't afraid of connection. They're hungry for it in a form that most social settings don't offer. They want the 2 a.m. conversation, not the birthday party. They want the one long phone call, not 20 short texts. And because that quality of connection is rare, solitude often feels more nourishing than the alternative. The fifth trait is metacognitive richness, which is simply the technical way of saying, you think about your own thinking more than most. You're not just living through an experience. You're observing yourself living through it, processing what it means, connecting it to everything else you know and feel and remember. This is the trait that makes you the person who leaves a conversation and replays it for 2 days, who reads a book and finds yourself annotating it in your head weeks later, who can spend an entire afternoon alone with a thought and emerge from it having genuinely moved somewhere. Metacognitive richness is closely linked to both emotional intelligence and creative capacity, and it's also closely linked to the experience of social exhaustion. When your brain is running 3 layers of processing simultaneously, what's happening, what it means, and what you'll think about it later, a crowd is genuinely cognitive labor in a way. It simply isn't for someone with a quieter processing system. These 5 traits don't make you better than anyone, but they do make you fundamentally different from the baseline the world was built for. And that difference has a name now. Picture a woman named Claire, 31 years old, graphic designer. She's been the same way her entire adult life. The one who leaves parties early, who screens calls from people she loves, who genuinely looks forward to canceled plans in a way that makes her feel guilty. She's read the introvert books. She's done the therapy. She's sold herself. She's working on it. But nothing has ever fully explained the exhaustion. Not just the tiredness, the specific kind that feels like she's been translating a foreign language all day. She's in a group chat with 6 friends. There are 47 unread messages from the last 3 hours. Each one requires not just reading, but interpreting the tone, the subtext, the social dynamic underneath. She types and deletes responses 4 times before sending something neutral. And by 9 p.m., she's sitting on her bathroom floor, not because anything went wrong, but because everything just required so much. Her therapist eventually introduces her to research on sensory processing sensitivity, and something in Claire shifts, not dramatically, not with a single revelation, but with the specific quiet of a thing finally being named. She starts to understand that the 47 messages aren't just a lot of messages. For her brain, there are 47 pieces of full-frequency signal that all need processing. She stops calling the exhaustion weakness. She starts calling it information. She doesn't stop being social, but she becomes precise about it. 2 real conversations instead of 10 surface ones. Shorter windows with higher quality. She starts treating her solitude not as avoidance, but as calibration, the thing her specific brain requires to stay clear, stay sharp, stay genuinely present when it matters. She doesn't change who she is. She stops apologizing for it, and that turns out to be the whole thing. Let's come back to where we started. That Saturday night, the phone face down, the relief that came with saying no, followed immediately by the question that's followed you for years. What's wrong with me? Nothing is wrong with you. What you've been calling antisocial is high sensory processing sensitivity protecting your nervous system from overload. What you've been calling awkward is low latent inhibition registering everything in the room at once. What you've been calling lazy is a default mode network doing genuine intellectual and emotional work that looks, from the outside, like nothing. What you've been calling too much is just a different resolution. You don't have a social problem. You have a deep signal architecture. And the reason the world has never quite fit is because the world wasn't built for the resolution you're running at. It was built for speed, for volume, for surfaces. And you are built for something else entirely. The 5 traits we talked about today, sensory depth, a rich inner world, an open filter, depth-seeking, and connection, and the habit of thinking about your own thinking. They are not a cluster of inconveniences you need to manage. They are the same traits behind your capacity for deep focus, for noticing what others miss, for the specific quality of presence you bring when you're in the right room with the right person having the right conversation, the ones people remember. You are not behind. You are not broken. You are not built for every room. You are built for the right ones, and that changes everything. The exhaustion you felt your whole life in spaces that were never designed for you, that wasn't failure. That was signal, your brain telling you, in the clearest language it had, that you were somewhere that wasn't worth the cost. You just didn't have the framework to hear it correctly until now. You don't need to become an extrovert. You don't need to push through every crowded room until it stops feeling hard. What you need, what the deep signal architecture actually requires, is precision. Not more social energy. More intentional social use of the energy you have, fewer rooms, better ones, less noise, more signal. You weren't avoiding life by staying home. You were protecting the conditions that let you actually live it. Which of these 5 traits hit the closest to home for you? The sensory depth, the rich inner world that makes small talk feel hollow, the low latent inhibition that makes crowded rooms feel like labor. Drop it in the comments and tell me the moment when you first started to realize this about yourself. Not when someone told you, when you knew. If this is the kind of content that makes you understand yourself a little more clearly, subscribe. We go deeper every week on Mind Beneath.